To Sir Watkin Phillips, of Jesus College, Oxon. Dear Phillips, without waiting for your answer to my last, I proceed to give you an account of our journey to London, which has not been wholly barren of adventure. Tuesday last the squire took his place in a hired coach and four, accompanied by his sister and mine, and Mrs. Tabby's maid, Winifred Jenkins, whose province it was to support Chowder on a cushion in her lap. I could scarce refrain from laughing when I looked into the vehicle and saw that animal sitting opposite to my uncle, like any other passenger. The squire, ashamed of his situation, blushed to the eyes, and, calling to the postilions to drive on, pulled the glass up in my face. I, and his servant, John Thomas, attended them on horseback. Nothing worth mentioning occurred, till we arrived on the edge of Marlborough Downs. There one of the four horses fell, in going downhill at a round trot, and the postilion behind, endeavouring to stop the carriage, pulled it on one side into a deep rut, where it was fairly overturned. I had rode on about 200 yards before, but, hearing a loud scream, galloped back and dismounted, to give what assistance was in my power. When I looked into the coach, I could see nothing distinctly but the nether end of Jenkins, who was kicking her heels and squalling with great vociferation. All of a sudden, my uncle thrust up his bare pate, and bolted through the window, as nimble as a grasshopper, having made use of poor Wind's posteriors as a step to rise in his ascent. The man, who had likewise quitted his horse, dragged this forlorn damsel, more dead than alive, through the same opening. Then Mr. Bramble, pulling the door off its hinges with a jerk, laid hold on Liddy's arm, and brought her to the light, very much fright, but little hurt. It fell to my share to deliver our Aunt Tabitha, who had lost her cap in the struggle, and being rather more than half frantic, with rage and terror, was no bad representation of one of the sister furies that guard the gates of hell. She expressed no sort of concern for her brother, who ran about in the cold, without his periwig, and worked with the most astonishing agility, in helping to disentangle the horses from the carriage, but she cried, in a tone of distraction, "Chowder! Chowder! My dear Chowder! My poor Chowder is certainly killed." This was not the case. Chowder, after having torn my uncle's leg in the confusion of the fall, had retreated under the scat, and from thence the footman drew him by the neck, for which good office he bit his fingers to the bone. The fellow, who is naturally surly, was so provoked at this assault, that he saluted his ribs with a hearty kick, exclaiming, "Damn the nasty son of a bitch, and them he belongs to." A benediction, which was by no means lost upon the implacable virago his mistress. Her brother, however, prevailed upon her to retire into a peasant's house, near the scene of action, where his head and hers were covered, and poor Jenkins had a fit. Our next care was to apply some sticking plaister to the wound in his leg, which exhibited the impression of Chowder's teeth, but he never opened his lips against the delinquent. Mrs. Tabby, alarmed at this scene, "You say nothing, Matt," cried she, "but I know your mind, I know the spite you have to that poor unfortunate animal. I know you intend to take his life away." "You are mistaken, upon my honour," replied the squire, with a sarcastic smile. "I should be incapable of harbouring any such cruel design against an object so amiable and inoffensive, even if he had not the happiness to be your favourite." John Thomas was not so delicate. The fellow, whether really alarmed for his life, or instigated by the desire of revenge, came in, and bluntly demanded that the dog should be put to death, on the supposition that if ever he should run mad hereafter, he, who had been bit by him, would be infected. My uncle calmly argued upon the absurdity of his opinion, observing that he himself was in the same predicament, and would certainly take the precaution he proposed, if he was not sure he ran no risk of infection. Nevertheless, Thomas continued obstinate, and, at length declared, that if the dog was not shot immediately, he himself would be his executioner. This declaration opened the floodgates of Tabby's eloquence, which would have shamed the first-rate oratress of Billingsgate. The footman retorted in the same style, and the squire dismissed him from his service, after having prevented me from giving him a good horsewhipping for his insolence. The coach being adjusted, another difficulty occurred. Mrs. Tabitha absolutely refused to enter it again, unless another driver could be found to take the place of the postilion, who, she affirmed, had overturned the carriage from malice aforethought. After much dispute, the man resigned his place to a shabby country fellow, who undertook to go as far as Marlborough, where they could be better provided. and at that place we arrived about 1 o'clock, without farther impediment. Mrs. Bramble, however, found new matter of offence, which, indeed, she has a particular genius for extracting at will from almost every incident in life. We had scarce entered the room at Marlborough, where we stayed to dine, when she exhibited a formal complaint against the poor fellow who had superseded the postilion. She said he was such a beggarly rascal that he had ne'er a shirt to his back, and had the impudence to shock her sight by shoeing his bare posteriors, for which act of indelicacy he deserved to be set in the stocks. Mrs. Winifred Jenkins confirmed the assertion with respect to his nakedness, observing, at the same time, that he had a skin as fair as alabaster. "This is a heinous offence, indeed," cried my uncle. "Let us hear what the fellow has to say in his own vindication." He was accordingly summoned, and made his appearance, which was equally queer and pathetic. He seemed to be about 20 years of age, of a middling size, with bandy legs, stooping shoulders, high forehead, sandy locks, pinking eyes, flat nose, and long chin, but his complexion was of a sickly yellow, his looks denoted famine, and the rags that he wore could hardly conceal what decency requires to be covered. My uncle, having surveyed him attentively, said, with an ironical expression in his countenance, "Aren't you ashamed, fellow, to ride postilion without a shirt to cover your backside? From the view of the ladies in the coach?" "Yes, I am, and please your noble honour," answered the man, "but necessity has no law, as the saying is, and more than that, it was an accident. My breeches cracked behind, after I had got into the saddle." "You're an impudent varlet," cried Mrs. Tabby, "for presuming to ride before persons of fashion without a shirt." "I am so, and please your worthy ladyship," said he, "but I am a poor Wiltshire lad. I ha'n't a shirt in the world, that I can call my own, nor a rag of clothes, and please your ladyship, but what you see, I have no friend nor relation upon earth to help me out. I have had the fever and ague these 6 months, and spent all I had in the world upon doctors, and to keep soul and body together, and, saving your ladyship's good presence, I ha'n't broke bread these 24 hours. Mrs. Bramble, turning from him, said she had never seen such a filthy tatterdemalion, and bid him begone, observing that he would fill the room full of vermin. Her brother darted a significant glance at her, as she retired with Liddy into another apartment, and then asked the man if he was known to any person in Marlborough, when he answered that the landlord of the inn had known him from his infancy. Mine host was immediately called, and being interrogated on the subject, declared that the young fellow's name was Humphrey Clinker, that he had been a love-begotten babe, brought up in the workhouse, and put out apprentice by the parish to a country blacksmith, who died before the boy's time was out, that he had for some time worked under his ostler, as a helper and extra postilion, till he was taken ill of the ague, which disabled him from getting his bread, that, having sold or pawned everything he had in the world for his cure and subsistence, he became so miserable and shabby, that he disgraced the stable, and was dismissed, but that he never heard anything to the prejudice of his character in other respects. So that the fellow being sick and destitute, said my uncle, you turned him out to die in the streets. I pay the poor's rate, replied the other, and I have no right to maintain idle vagrants either in sickness or health. Besides, such a miserable object would have brought a discredit upon my house. You perceive, said the squire, turning to me, our landlord is a Christian of bowels, who shall presume to censure the morals of the age, when the very publicans exhibit such examples of humanity? Hark ye, Clinker, you are a most notorious offender, you stand convicted of sickness, hunger, wretchedness, and want, but, as it does not belong to me to punish criminals, I will only take upon me the task of giving you a word of advice. Get a shirt with all convenient dispatch, that your nakedness may not henceforward give offence to travelling gentlewomen, especially maidens in years. So saying, he put a guinea into the hand of the poor fellow, who stood staring at him in silence, with his mouth wide open, till the landlord pushed him out of the room. In the afternoon, as our aunt stepped into the coach, she observed, with some marks of satisfaction, that the postilion, who rode next to her, was not a shabby wretch like the ragamuffin who had them into Marlborough. Indeed, the difference was very conspicuous. This was a smart fellow, with a narrow-brimmed hat, with gold cording, a cut bob, a decent blue jacket, leather breeches, and a clean linen shirt, puffed above the waistband. When we arrived at the castle, on Spinhill, where we lay, this new postilion was remarkably assiduous in bringing in the loose parcels, and, at length, displayed the individual countenance of Humphrey Clinker, who had metamorphosed himself in this manner, by relieving from pawn part of his own clothes, with the money he had received from Mr. Bramble. Howsoever pleased the rest of the company were with such a favourable change in the appearance of this poor creature it soured on the stomach of Mrs. Tabby, who had not yet digested the affront of his naked skin. She tossed her nose in disdain, saying, she supposed her brother had taken him into favour, because he had insulted her with his obscenity, that a fool and his money were soon parted, but that if Matt intended to take the fellow with him to London, she would not go a foot further that way. My uncle said nothing with his tongue, though his looks were sufficiently expressive, and next morning Clinker did not appear, so that we proceeded without further altercation to Salt Hill, where we proposed to dine. There, the first person that came to the side of the coach, and began to adjust the footboard, was no other than Humphrey Clinker. When I handed out Mrs. Bramble, she eyed him with a furious look, and passed into the house. My uncle was embarrassed, and asked him peevishly what had brought him hither. The fellow said, his honour had been so good to him, that he had not the heart to part with him, that he would follow him to the world's end, and serve him all the days of his life, without fee or reward. Mr. Bramble did not know whether to chide or laugh at this declaration. He foresaw much contradiction on the side of Tabby, and on the other hand, he could not but be pleased with the gratitude of Clinker, as well as with the simplicity of his character. Suppose I was inclined to take you into my service, said he, what are your qualifications? What are you good for? And please your honour, answered this original, I can read and write, and do the business of the stable indifferent well. I can dress a horse, and shoe him, and bleed and rowel him, and, as for the practice of so gelding, I won't turn my back on e'er he in the county of Wilts. Then I can make hogs puddings and hobnails, mend kettles and tin saucepans. Here uncle burst out laughing, and inquired what other accomplishments he was master of. I know something of single-stick and psalmody, proceeded Clinker. I can play upon the Jew's harp, sing Black-Eyed Susan, Arthur Bradley, and divers other songs. I can dance a Welsh jig, and Nancy Dawson, wrestle a foal with any lad of my inches, when I'm in heart, and, under correction, I can find a hare when your honour wants a bit of game. 'Fore Gad! Thou art a complete fellow, cried my uncle, still laughing. I have a good mind to take thee into my family. Prithee, go and try if thou canst make peace with my sister. Thou hast given her much offence by shewing her thy naked tail. Clinker accordingly followed us into the room, cap in hand, where, addressing himself to Mrs. Tabitha, may it please your ladyship's worship, cried he, to pardon and forgive my offences, and, with God's assistance, I shall take care that my tale shall never rise up in judgment against me, to offend your ladyship again. Do, pray, good, sweet, beautiful lady, take compassion on a poor sinner. God bless your noble countenance. I am sure you are too handsome and generous to bear malice. I will serve you on my bended knees, by night and by day, by land and by water, and all for the love and pleasure of serving such an excellent lady. This compliment and humiliation had some effect upon Tabby, but she made no reply, and Clinker, taking silence for consent, gave his attendance at dinner. The fellow's natural awkwardness and the flutter of his spirits were productive of repeated blunders in the course of his attendance. At length, he spilt part of a custard upon her right shoulder, and, starting back, trod upon Chowder, who set up a dismal howl. Poor Humphrey was so disconcerted at this double mistake, that he dropped the china dish, which broke into 1,000 pieces, then, falling down upon his knees, remained in that posture gaping, with a most ludicrous aspect of distress. Mrs. Bramble flew to the dog, and, snatching him in her arms, presented him to her brother, saying, "This is all a concerted scheme against this unfortunate animal, whose only crime is its regard for me. Here it is, kill it at once, and then you'll be satisfied." Clinker, hearing these words, and taking them in the literal acceptation, got up in some hurry, and seizing a knife from the sideboard, cried, "Not here, and please your ladyship, it will daub the room. Give him to me, and I'll carry him to the ditch by the roadside." To this proposal he received no other answer than a hearty box on the ear, that made him stagger to the other side of the room. "What?" said she to her brother, "am I to be affronted by every mangy hound that you pick up on the highway? I insist upon your sending this rascal lion about his business immediately. For God's sake, sister, compose yourself, said my uncle, and consider that the poor fellow is innocent of any intention to give you offense. Innocent as the babe unborn, cried Humphrey. I see it plainly, exclaimed this implacable maiden. He acts by your direction, and you are resolved to support him in his impudence. This is a bad return for all the services I have done you, for nursing you in your sickness, managing your family, and keeping you from ruining yourself by your own imprudence. But now you shall part with that rascal or me, upon the spot, without farther loss of time, and the world shall see whether you have more regard for your own flesh and blood, or for a beggarly foundling taken from the dunghill. Mr. Bramble's eyes began to glisten, and his teeth to chatter. If stated fairly, said he, raising his voice, the question is, whether I have spirit to shake off an intolerable yoke, by one effort of resolution, or meanness enough to do an act of cruelty and injustice, to gratify the rancor of a capricious woman. Hark ye, Mrs. Tabitha Bramble, I will now propose an alternative in my turn. Either discard your four-footed favourite, or give me leave to bid you eternally adieu, for I am determined that he and I shall live no longer under the same roof, and to dinner with what appetite you may. Thunderstruck at this declaration, she sat down in a corner, and, after a pause of some minutes, "Sure, I don't understand you, Matt," said she. "And yet I spoke in plain English," answered the squire, with a peremptory look. "Sir," resumed this virago, effectually humbled, "it is your prerogative to command, and my duty to obey. I can't dispose of the dog in this place, but if you'll allow him to go in the coach to London, I give you my word, he shall never trouble you again." Her brother, entirely disarmed by this mild reply, declared she could ask him nothing in reason that he would refuse, adding, "I hope, sister, you have never found me deficient in natural affection." Mrs. Tabitha immediately rose, and, throwing her arms about his neck, kissed him on the cheek. He returned her embrace with great emotion. Liddy sobbed, Win. Jenkins cackled, Chabber capered, and Clinker skipped about, rubbing his hands for joy of this reconciliation. Concord being thus restored, we finished our meal with comfort, and in the evening arrived at London, without having met with any other adventure. My aunt seems to be much mended by the hint she received from her brother. She has been graciously pleased to remove her displeasure from Clinker, who is now retained as a footman, and in a day or two will make his appearance in a new suit of livery, but as he is little acquainted with London, we have taken an occasional valet, whom I intend hereafter to hire as my own servant. We lodge in Golden Square, at the house of one Mrs. Notion, a decent sort of a woman, who takes great pains to make us all easy. My uncle proposes to make a circuit of all the remarkable scenes of this metropolis, for the entertainment of his pupils, but as both you and I are already acquainted with most of those he will visit, and with some others he little dreams of, I shall only communicate what will be in some measure new to your observation. Remember me to our Jesuitical friends, and believe me ever, dear knight, yours affectionately, J. Melford. London, May 24th.